Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for December 15th, 2021. Well, there's a lot of unfinished business in the relationship between the transatlantic countries and Russia, with the tension continuing over Ukraine. There are ongoing diplomatic efforts to de-escalate coming from Russia, coming from Biden, although there are many among Biden's team who are doing everything they can to fan the flames. But let's start by looking at some of the international developments that are related to this. And you'll see that the world is moving in a direction possibly away from the control of the war hawks of the UK-US military alliance, the otherwise run by the City of London and Wall Street. Putin had a conversation with France's President Macron yesterday. It included an extensive discussion of the Ukraine situation, where Putin presented the evidence of Ukraine's violations of the Minsk agreements, which the Ukrainian government had signed on to. This is something that he had discussed with Biden, and Biden had pledged in their summit that he would see about setting up a discussion between Macron, the German Chancellor, Boris Johnson himself, Putin and Biden, to discuss the Minsk Accords and what could be done to resolve that, to get the Ukrainians to adopt it, to follow through with what they signed, and then secondly, to discuss what can be done about eastward expansion of NATO. Now, Biden didn't make any firm, hard pledges in the discussion with Putin as far as we know, but he did say he's open to discuss these things. And that's one of the main things the Russians were looking for. But to hear the talk coming from Stoltenberg of NATO, the new German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, to hear the discussion from a number of other leaders, including the British foreign minister and Tony Blinken, the decision was made that Russia is at fault, Russia is the provocateur, and Russia must back off. And that if Russia does invade, which no one has any evidence that there's an intent on Putin's part to invade Ukraine, but they keep saying if Russia does invade, there will be harsh consequences. It reminds me of the old joke about the anti-communist league in a small town in Iowa, where they met every Monday night to discuss keeping communists out. And a new member came in one day and said, "Why are we discussing this? There's not a communist within 200 miles of here." And the leader said, "You see how effective we are?" So by making up these fake charges, they're creating a circumstance where, on the one hand, they're giving confidence to the crazies in Kiev that they can go ahead and poke the Russians in the eye. And if the Russians respond, we'll get NATO backup. On the other hand, the more senior, thoughtful thinkers realize the last thing that anyone would want is a war with Russia over Ukraine. How many Germans are willing to die? How many French are willing to die? How many Italians are willing to die? How many Americans are willing to die to defend the corrupt kleptocrats of the Ukrainian government who are provoking a war with Russia? And so diplomacy is the only way out. There have been wars in Europe in the last century that were devastating to all countries, and this is something that must be avoided at all costs. Now, at the same time, Putin and Xi had a lengthy video conference today, and the theme was peace and cooperation, and how to turn their border into a, quote, belt of everlasting peace and good neighborliness. Putin referenced the increase in bilateral trade by 31% between the two countries from January to November of this year. Now, as I mentioned, there's a continuing drumbeat from many of the people of Biden's cabinet of threats against Russia, of a NATO buildup, of more arms. So I'll have more coverage of this tomorrow as we get more reports also of the various meetings and discussions underway. Let me shift to what happened in Berlin today, where Olaf Scholz, the new chancellor of an unworkable coalition, gave his first formal address to the Bundestag. The major point he made was on climate. And on this, he was trying to reassure the Germans that they don't have much to worry about with the radical transformation that he's promising, egged on by the Green cabinet members who are part of his cabinet. He said that they must have this radical transformation because of the climate, because of the necessity from the heating up of the planet. But he said he understands the concerns with the effects that this transformation will have on jobs and quality of life. But he went on to escalate the pace of the transformation. He said the exit from coal will be moved up from 2038 to 2030, as had already been promised, if renewables can make up the gap left by the exit from nuclear and coal. That's not likely. The estimates are that there's already a 20% gap just from the shutdown of the nuclear plants before the full nuclear exit. This gap could go 40 to 60%. And with a cold winter, what's going to make up the difference? Germany is moving, if you move away from coal and nuclear, then you have fossil fuel. But the pipeline from Russia, the Nord Stream 2, has not yet been approved. In fact, if the sanction mania of Blinken and the Greens and the German government dominates, then there won't be any natural gas coming from Russia. So then what is Germany left with? Absolutely unsustainable, irregular, inefficient, so-called renewable energy, wind and sun. And I can tell you from here in Berlin, we see the sun about once every 8 days. The idea that somehow you're going to have a miraculous combination of sunshine and wind to power the German economy, which until recently was one of the most efficient in the world, including in energy production and distribution, it no longer is. And rates are skyrocketing. So how Scholz can say, well, we'll do this, we'll escalate this exit if the renewables can make up the gap. The aim includes reducing fossil fuel use by 80%, I think by 2035. He's also talking about 15 million electric cars. People who lose their jobs in the auto industry and in the steel sector and in other areas are not going to be able to afford the price tag for electric cars. Is the German government going to buy everyone an electric car? Are they going to flatten the countryside to put battery renewal stations up every 20 kilometers? Well, none of this is practical and none of this is sensible. But this is the pledge that they ran on. Now, he went on to say, well, don't worry, we're going to increase the mobility of trains, of subways, increase the mobility of transportation to make up for the loss. And he said people can still drive private cars if they are climate friendly. Well, what does that mean? You're going to have to go get your car checked every week to see if it's producing too much CO2? So this is a catastrophe, this new government on energy. Now, the other area of the catastrophe is that the war hawks of the Green Party are dominating the strategic picture. And what Scholz promised is that Germany's future security depends on the European Union. If that's the case, there's not much future security for Europe because the European Union has proven to be brain dead. As Macron said not too long ago, as President Trump was saying when he was president of the United States, the fact that NATO is blindly going along with an expansion policy to provoke Russia, that the European Union is insisting that there'll be less trade and commerce with China because of human rights violations, ignoring the human rights violations in Europe and the United States, this scenario doesn't function. That's why we have to have sane voices speaking out, not just people that you know that are already in policy-making positions, but from the public. We need the citizens to have an input so that we actually can have a return to sovereign nation states that have governments that fight for the interests of their people, not for the corporate global cartels. So that's my update for today. I'll be back with you tomorrow.